Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you today to this program with the award-winning author and professor Elizabeth Graver and Gloria Abella Ballen, who will interview her. I would like to thank all of you who've donated to make the Distinguished Lecture Series possible, and I would like to especially thank Dr. Fa Abrantes Pais and Paula Sass Donnelly for underwriting this program today. When our world is living through an all too human time of turmoil and wars and political conflicts, the goal of the Distinguished Lecture Series is that we bring islands of respite and enlightenment. We seek truth and our better human selves in bringing the best of national and international authors and scholars. And today, such an author joins us. Elizabeth Graver is a highly acclaimed, award-winning author and a Guggenheim Fellow, among many other awards. She's on the English faculty of Boston College, where she's the co-director of the Concentration on Creative Writing. She teaches fiction and nonfiction writing, including one workshop which is called Writing Across Cultures, which calls my attention as an anthropologist. Um, that would be a workshop that many anthropologists could profit from, I think. Kantika is her fifth novel, and it won the National Jewish Book Award, the Edward Lewis Wallant Award, the Julia Ward Howe Award, and the Massachusetts Book Award, among others. That's kind of like winning the World Series in a sweep. Um, Her fourth novel, The End of the Point, was longlisted for the 2013 National Book Award in fiction. Her other novels are Awake, The Honey Thief, and Unraveling. Her short story collection, Have You Seen Me, won the 1991 Drew Hines Literary Prize. Professor Graver will be interviewed by Gloria Abella Ballen, a former professor of art who is also an award-winning author and visual artist. She's co-founder of the Institute for Tolerant Studies and the Distinguished Lecture Series. Her books, The Power of the Hebrew Alphabet, The Garden of Eden, and The New World Haggadah with Ilan Stavans, have won multiple awards. And she has won awards for painting and graphic arts from the National Endowment for the Arts, UNESCO, the Latin American Graphics Biennial, and the Mishkan Omanim in Israel, among others. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to the program today, and thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you. Elizabeth, I am so happy that we can talk and that we can discuss your book, Kantika.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me. It's a delight, and your organization's wonderful. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So, Elizabeth, one thing that I wonder is why did you call your book Kantika?
So that's a lovely question. Interestingly, it's not the title that when I handed the book out, when the book went out to be viewed by editors, was the title. It was called Scatter and Seed. But you can tell already when I say that, it's hard to hear. It doesn't stick. It's got issues. So, and I also knew from past experience with novels that often whatever title I have as a kind of placeholder, there needs to be a conversation with editors farther down the line. So my editor, I remember we were kind of brainstorming. I ended up with a very wonderful editor called Reva Hockerman, who really understood the book. And I thought of this title, and my first thought was, oh, they're going to say it's too strange. It's not English. It's not even Spanish. Like the general reader will have no idea what it is. But I really liked it, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But so I called her and said, I have this idea, but it's a bit weird. And she said, weird is good. And I thought, really? Wow, that's great. And she really liked it. So it had to go sort of through some steps. But ultimately, the reason I'm really thrilled that it ended up being the title Well, there's a few reasons. One is that, as you know, Gloria, the book is filled with Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, and it's a language that is in risk of disappearing, although there's amazing efforts to keep it going and revitalize it right now. But part of what I was interested in with this book in doing was kind of giving people a glimpse of this extraordinarily rich culture and language that is not mainstream and is kind of, I think Ladino is actually listed as a endangered language by UNESCO. So I love that. But I also was really interested in the fact that it was a word that some people would understand and feel this little moment of pleasure and recognition, and that many wouldn't, because my book is a book about migration and language crossings and having to figure things out. And so, you can see, this is my kind of beat up copy because I use it for talks, but you can see that it's a sort of portal here and this broken tile. And I actually liked the feeling that a reader might not quite know what it meant and be invited in. So of course it means song, right, in Ladino, and it has kind of cognates in other languages. So it sounds like contar in French, or canticle. So there's sort of enough that's familiar, and yet then it's got this weird spiky spelling. I just love the K's. I love that you're a visual artist, because I'm a very both oral and visual person, and I loved how it looked. I just liked its spikiness, and then its sort of beautiful A at the end. And the book is really, it has a lot of literal singing in it. So it's inspired by my grandmother, who's never stopped singing, sang all the time. It's filled with Ladino songs and lullabies, which were things that could be carried with you on migration, handed down from generation to generation. They're portable, they're simple and short. And then I also viewed the book itself almost as a song, or almost as a duet with my grandmother and some of my other relatives. So that it was an effort to kind of make something beautiful, but at times painful and poetic and very tactile and kind of sensory. And so the title just enveloped both literally in terms of the Ladino and in terms of the fact that the book begins and ends with singing, that it's a literal theme, but it's also a theme in a lot of other ways. And I was interested in how music and singing can be very culturally specific, but they can also reach audiences who don't understand the words. So there's a moment in the novel where there's a word that's not translatable, and Rebecca's like, it doesn't matter. Like, the word is aman. She's like, it doesn't matter. People will hear it. So those are some of the reasons.
Yeah, so this is very interesting that you talk about the songs, because how do you see in the book the role of songs in the cultural context?
It's a great question. I haven't thought about it quite that specifically. I mean, I think songs in any cultural context have different, they have liturgical functions. They can be lullabies, and they can be playful. They can be funny. I love how a lot of the Ladino music and kind of adages are quite irreverent and kind of about daily life. They're often about women's lives. So there's something very on the ground about them, right? They're very earthy a lot of the time, but they're also often about the kind of mix of suffering and beauty. So a song might be about something really painful, but the melody is really gorgeous. And so there's this kind of tension in a way that's a lot of what my writing is about, I think, that often I'm writing about hard things through what I hope is beautiful language. And so there's this kind of play between, I mean, but then also I think that the songs connect people. And as I said, connect people over migration. We were talking when we were just chatting before the webinar started about the singer Sarah Aresti, who does beautiful work in Sephardic music. And she and I gave a talk where she talked about how the Ladino songs, many of them that have been passed down, are so short and so easy to remember that they're actually kind of cut out for migration, right? That they can be passed down in the way that, say, a house can't or land can't, that you can take them with you. And then they're also really interesting to me in that there's many different versions of them, right? So from different parts of the world, and even from the same part of the world, people kind of improvise. And my grandmother in real life, the person who inspired the heart of this novel, was an incredible improviser. She did not stick to the truth. She was very fluid in a whole bunch of different ways. And so I kind of love that it's like, yeah, there's this version, and they're both good. They count, you know.
Yeah. So, in this way, we can see the role of songs in cultural context, because sometimes the songs would say something that that the singer or that the community itself would not say openly. But if it is said in a song, then you can just say everything and smile. Yeah, you're singing
That's
it.
a little like writing fiction, right?
Exactly,
Like I could have written
exactly.
this book as nonfiction, but I felt like there's an Emily Dickinson poem that starts, tell all the truth, but tell it slant, success and circuit lies. Something like, as lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And
Oh, wow.
that obliqueness, I think, is
Yeah.
to me a very interesting thing.
Yeah. So, in your book is extraordinary in as far as you don't know what's the thing that you added that is not real. Yes, because you wove so very well your thoughts with the culture of these people who happen to be modeled on your family, on your grandmother, and so on and so forth. So since you did a lot of research, I wonder how how did you see the effects of Turkish nationalism in what happened to the family?
So from what I have gleaned from my reading, and this book took me almost a decade because I knew nothing coming in. I mean, I knew I'd grown up with my grandmother and my mother and my grandfather, but I was not steeped in this at all. I'd been to Turkey once. So I really consulted a lot of historians. I have a long acknowledgement page. There's a historian at Stanford called Eran Rodriguez, who was incredibly generous. I've still never met him, but I sent him my manuscript. And he was really helpful. But so as I understand it, that Turkish nationalism, on the one hand, looked like it could be a good thing for minority communities because it was kind of saying everybody's the same, everybody's a citizen. But that in fact, the way it played out, it kind of erased a lot of difference. So Jews were, there were things where we were told citizens speak Turkish in the streets. You weren't supposed to speak Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. All the education was supposed to be in Turkish. Other minority communities, like even Sufis, weren't allowed to whirl. There were whirling dervishes. There were a lot of kind of things that were erased in the name of a sort of democracy, but that in fact it was a majority Muslim, and even one particular kind of, it wasn't in fact welcoming of difference. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was that there was mandatory military service all of a sudden for young men, including Jewish men, and they were very poorly treated. So they would be sent out to the kind of hinterlands and given really bad jobs and not allowed to rise through the ranks. And there wasn't the food they were used to. So my understanding is that a lot of people left, some in that period for economic reasons, but also often fleeing mandatory military service and looking for places where they could have more autonomy in how they expressed their culture. And there had been the Armenian genocide. Like there were things happening that were very horrible and kind of concerning for other minority populations. So obviously the whole Jewish community didn't leave, but my grandfather's family left before my grandmother's, and he grew up very, very poor in Ortaköy in Istanbul. And I think the poor families tended to leave first because they had less to lose, and they were more desperate. My grandmother had always said to us when I was growing up, and I told you she played a little fast and loose with the truth, so I was never sure, but she would tell us she grew up really rich. And she would say provocatively, better to be born poor than to be rich and lose everything. And I remember as a kid thinking, really? Like, I don't know about that, but it turns out she was quite rich, because when I went back and saw where she had lived and saw where they had a summer house and learned about the schools she went to private Catholic school, very interesting for a young Jewish girl of that time. And so her family held on longer. And I think by the time they realized they really wanted to get out, it was much harder, because particularly the US had shut its doors. This was post 1924, when there was a big immigration act that was discriminatory against all kinds of people, including Turkish people and Jews. So they went to, quote, back to Spain, which is one of the weirdest turns of my book, that when I told Turkish people, Sephardic people from Turkey about this, they were skeptical. They were like, oh, come on. That they kind of thought I'd made it up, but because it was such a strange place to go.
Yeah. So, there is a lot of loss in the book. How do you treat this? Tell us, how do you treat this in terms of history and fiction?
So I think a lot of it has to do with inner life. I mean, there's several things. One is there were times when I just didn't know enough. So I used everything I knew. I have these tape recordings from my grandmother from when I interviewed her decades ago. I interviewed my two uncles, Albert and David, who sadly passed away before the book came out, but knew it was coming. And I spent days with them. I did lots and lots of research, both historical and familial, but there were still times when I didn't have enough. Like I didn't know. I didn't know the name of my great grandfather's first wife. I knew, for example, that my grandmother used to say that she lived in their neighborhood in Fener in Istanbul, and that she had no children, and she was loca, they used to say. She was mentally ill.
Yeah.
And she would sit in her window and call out to Rebecca, my grandmother, her former husband's child. So I knew that much. But I ended up giving her a name and bringing Rebecca into her apartment. So basically, a lot of these, when I talked about the portal on the cover, they were almost like invitations to me to imagine. And as a fiction writer, it's inner life and emotion that's the heartbeat. Like, that's why I'm write fiction, is to kind of get inside. So you can't get inside another person's head unless you're imagining. It's, subjectivity doesn't allow for that, unless you're psychic. And so I think fiction was it was both, it offered me that emotional terrain, like somebody like Alberto, my great grandfather, who I never met, my mother never met. He died, I don't know how much, I don't want to give away too much if people haven't read the book, but
don't. No.
He died far away from before my mother was born.
Yeah.
And I knew a teeny bit about him. I knew he loved to garden. I knew he was a bad businessman. I knew he was scholarly and loved to read about Judaism. And I knew he'd been a caretaker of this hidden synagogue in Barcelona. But I knew I could count on one hand what I knew. And somehow, when I started writing about him, I really thought setting out that this book would be all in Rebecca's point of view. And he was the first character that just pulled me. And I was so captivated by him. He was this dignified old man. He was an Ottoman Jew. He was very identified with Turkey from everything I know. He did not want to leave. He viewed this is where his life was, and it had been a good life. And so that's an example of a character where I couldn't interview him. I did get to visit his grave in Barcelona, which was amazing, with my mother and her cousin Sylvia. We put pebbles on his grave. And, until I wrote this book, I didn't know where he was buried. So I kept discovering things. And then it was kind of
wonderful.
what are the moments where I can flare out and dig in by imagining, and then also in some cases, what are the gaps? Like if I don't know exactly what happened, or for example, I don't know that my family moved to Spain by going to an immigration office. I don't know. There are scenes where I had to kind of imagine how it might have went to get them from one place to another, because I know the dates and I know they went, but I don't know the granular details.
Yeah, exactly how. Yeah.
Right.
So, the fact that the book is called Kantika,
Mm-hmm.
So what is the role of songs in the cultural context of the book?
Yeah, I've talked about this a little already, but I think that the songs are kind of the glue that are bringing people from place to place and that are kind of helping them communicate with each other and carry beauty and carry playfulness, and that also the songs are different than the songs that they're encountering in the wider culture. They're different than the Spanish songs when they're in Barcelona. They're different than the Hebrew liturgy. The fact that they're in Ladino makes them this is a community that's a minority in most of the places they're going. So, for example, my grandmother, when they moved to New York, helped with my grandfather, found a little, at first, storefront synagogue that then became something called the Cambria Heights Jewish Center. And she was the only Sephardic person there. Maybe there were one or two others eventually. So and they thought she was sort of exotic in a little bit of a patronizing way, maybe, kind of, you're like Spanish exotic singer, but they also were interested. And so she would it was a way for her to have a voice in certain ways. And she was a real performer in the book and in real life. She would, if there was a piano or there was a stage, even at her nursing home, she was at a place in Brooklyn at the very end of her life called the Menorah Nursing Home, and she sang for everybody. And it was fascinating because a lot of the staff there were Spanish speaking, and most of the other elderly residents were Ashkenazi. So she'd sing in Spanish with the nurses and the aides and things. Like she would cross in different ways because of this linguistic gift, and also just the fact that I think she viewed music as a deep source of joy and solace, and also as a connector, as a community building thing, not in an intellectual way, just it was who she was.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you're saying, because actually the role of language in the formation of identity is very important in the novel. People think that, okay, you have a Spanish background, your relatives lived in Spain, a long time ago, and then people have the idea that you can go back to Spain and that you just fit right in.
Right, but of course they didn't fit in Spain, although they did in certain ways. I mean, I think they loved. There were a lot of ways in which there was both a lot of affection for Spanish things, Spanish food, Spanish culture, Spanish singing, etc., and a lot of trauma, right? Because they had been expelled. And so for my family, who did go, quote, back, I use that very hesitantly because they never lived there. They'd been in Turkey for many generations. In fact, my grandfather's family had been in Greece, at Salonika, or Turkey. So they were not Spanish. They were Sephardic, but they went there for very practical reasons, which was that Spain very briefly in the late 1920s had a law similar to a recent law, and kind of equally broken, I think, that supposedly wanted to give citizenship to some Sephardic Jews. And in the time of that law, I think it was, from what I understand, really having more to do with wanting people in places like North Africa, where there were Sephardic communities, to kind of do this sort of fading empire work. Like they didn't like that the Jewish community was being educated in French. They wanted them to speak Spanish. They wanted them to do trade with them. They didn't really want them to show up in Spain, but some did. There was a very small community. So my family went to Barcelona in the 1920s, and I still have relatives in Spain. And it's a very complicated place, I think, in terms of its relationship to its Jewish past and present. Many Spaniards have Jewish ancestry.
Sure.
They were conversos, or it was pushed aside. Some of them are rediscovering it. But I think it was a place with a lot of anxiety about what it meant to be Jewish, and it was hard to be Jewish there. So I think my grandmother, in certain ways, was lucky to kind of end up in the US, where I think there was more room. But she also quite loved Barcelona in different ways. For a young woman from Istanbul, it was a place with more freedoms for a woman, and it was beautiful and it was lively. It was also filled with tumult at that time. You know, the Spanish Civil War was on the horizon, and there was a lot of protests and a lot of poverty, and all. So, you know, these places are all so complicated.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yes. Yeah, you know, writing the book, did you find yourself discovering some of yourself that you had not become aware of?
That's a great question, Gloria. I mean, I was raised in a very culturally Jewish but completely secular family, by parents who were kind of intellectuals, had sort of turned away from. Now my mother belongs to a very Reformed synagogue, but when I was growing up in Western Mass, I went to Hebrew school for 2 weeks because I wanted to, and it was this cold place, and I didn't last long. But so the Jewish piece, I actually had a lot to learn about, and it was very moving and interesting. And I think, and then since the book has come out, I've really become in contact with a lot of different people through giving talks in different communities, and discovered more about the kind of enormous diversity of different kinds of Jewish congregations and Jewish history and Jewish writers. And so that has all been really, really interesting. And I think it has made me feel more connected. Interestingly, I've been aware as I was writing this book of what about the other side of my family? And now I'm doing research about my dad's side, which is a completely different story. So yes, it's been, and it's also just been, in the most literal way, a chance to get to know family members. You know, my mother's cousin in Barcelona, and a relative who's my grandfather's cousin, Said Aseo's son in Chicago. And, you know, and as with many Jewish diasporas, my family is all over the world, right? So we don't have a place to gather. I've always been close to my nuclear family and to my cousins, but
yes,
you know, so it has felt very connecting. And I guess another thing that I might want to just add is that I think it took me a long time to turn to this book. I think I needed confidence to write such a big book and such a historically complex book, but I think I was also spurred by both the generation above me, my mother, who's 88, and her siblings, et cetera, getting older, and wanting to give them the gift of this story, but also wanting to benefit from their expertise by getting to interview them. And then also what was happening in the world. So, you know, this book is a Jewish story and a Sephardic story, but as I was writing it, there's elements of the book where, for example, Rebecca separated from her sons by immigration law, and kids were being separated at the US border from their parents. So there, it was the first Trump presidency. There were things going on, and I teach a lot of first generation immigrant students. So there were things going on in the wider world where I felt like I'm not a politician. I'm not even really an activist, but like I sort of felt like by doing what I do, which is trying to really dive deep into one story that is incredibly particular and not didactic, but that actually has all these echoes with other stories, Sephardic, wider Jewish, and a zillion other stories that I was kind of able to, in a way that connected to me to my past, but also to my present, kind of metabolize, but also make something, you know, kind of what you were saying in such an interesting way, make something that was both beautiful and edgy, right? Tricky.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that you were able to bring about some of the voices from us people that have left their country, that are Jews, that are Sephardi, that have some of these elements, and that we all share, and that at the same time we all share the pain. The pain of going and moving and learning another language and another culture and all that. And you tackle a lot of this in your book. I found it so touching to me.
Thank you. Well, and I know you've had,
Yes.
because we were talking, you've had migrations in a way that I haven't. So that means a lot to me, because
Yes.
I've had a very stable, I'm
Yes.
sitting here right now in my mother's study in the house I lived in since I was 7. So I don't live here anymore.
Exactly.
But I don't live too far. I'm in the same state. So for me, I have not experienced those ruptures, but I find them incredibly powerful. A lot of the literature that I'm most drawn to is about migration, because I think that these human stories get put in sort of bas relief by these crossings. Questions of home and identity and what you bring and memory and exile are they're just so powerful. So I do feel like they were handed down to me in a certain way. My grandmother always seemed to me both someone very able to find joy in anything. Like you could give her, a tattered rag and she'd make a doll out of it. And with a kind of weight of, my mother, and I remember this too, she used to say, no one knows, but no one knows what I've been to. Nobody knows. A sense of she had this incredible journey, and even though she's not alive to see what I've invented out of it, I think she would appreciate it, because she was someone who she had a sort of very basic understanding that her voice was powerful, that every person had dignity. I think you can see that also in the novel with Luna, her stepdaughter, that every single human being had a kind of, I don't know if I would use this word because I'm not religious, but she was sort of sacredness to them, and that her story was worth telling, but she never really could tell it because she had 6 kids and she would have liked to be an artist. She who had the time. She didn't have money. So I feel like I'm in a position of privilege where in some ways I can channel and transform and make something, but that feels, my cousins and my mother and everybody sort of say she would have been excited by this, because it's also kind of tricky to write about your own family.
Of course. It's where do you start with the fiction and where the reality? What is the kind of reality that takes you to fiction? So where are the points of the fiction?
There's a lot of points, and I sort of like what you said earlier, that it doesn't matter, like that I know where they are. I know where I'm jumping off from the historical record or interviews, but I don't actually want the reader to be thinking about it, because I want to cast a spell where you're just taken in. So there are many places, but I mean, part of what was interesting to me in figuring this all out was that I could have written it as nonfiction, but I decided not to, because I wanted more inner life and there were too many gaps. And I also didn't want to be a character in it myself. I didn't, even though I had incredible experiences researching, I didn't want to be like, and then I went here and the house wasn't there anymore. That's all. But I also wanted to signal that it was based on real life. And so that's why it's a kind of strange novel. So it has, for people who haven't read it, I can give you a glimpse. Contains family photographs, and they're all real. And I didn't have that many, because particularly for the earlier eras, because the family left a lot behind and, had to gather small things and take a little bit with them. But I was interested in not so much having the reader think, where is it true, where is it not in particular moments, but kind of knowing that this was to return to the song, my song that was a sort of almost call and response to something that actually existed. And so I used real names a bunch of times, always with permission from the people who were still living. Everybody who was still living wanted their real name. If they hadn't, I would have changed them, because I think that's people's right. And I used these photographs. And so each chunk of the book starts with a photograph, which both signals reality, and at times is complicated because photos can kind of lie, or they can be used to make things look prettier than they are, or there's ways in which photos themselves aren't exactly. I mean, I'm sure, Ron, as an anthropologist, I'd be curious what you have to say, but there's ways in which some of these material things, they're not fact exactly either. They're all constructed. But so I was interested in, I took the photos and I'd really like turn them over and what are they wearing and blow them up and see what I could find culturally from them, but also think about them as things that were used to remember people who were gone or to set things up to get what you wanted. My grandmother, as you can see, I think from both the character and the and the photographs, was kind of a beauty, and she was a dressmaker, and she was really, really good at shape shifting, and she needed to a lot. So she would make herself look really European, or she would make herself look kind of dress in folk, kind of Turkish folkloric costumes. And so I was interested in how the photographs both were like, these were real people. They lived and breathed. They were my family. And they're slippery, right? They're self-presenting. They're having to use, she needed, I think, to use her skills as a dressmaker and an embroiderer to support herself, to pass sometimes as not Jewish, in order to earn a living in Spain. I made some of that up, but not all of it. And so again, the sort of, I'm showing some seams about where kind of reality, there's a real base, but when you're actually reading it, I mean, I could go through and say, made this up, got this from grandmother, got this from a book, but
no,
book would like light up. If I traced like Sharpie in different or highlight different colors, it would be a big mess. And really, when you're reading it, I just want you to be kind of like, I'm in here, I'm with their lives.
Sure. That is what is so wonderful in the book. You were able to pin on the feelings of every individual.
Thank you.
To me, it touched in so many points, so many places in the development of my life.
That's great. I'd love to hear that. Thank you. Well, I'm really interested in how multilingual this society is. So my grandmother's first language was Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. That's what they spoke in the home. But she was educated in French. She spoke some Turkish. She eventually went to German school because after World War I, the French schools were, or during World War I, the French schools were shut down. And then, of course, she eventually spoke English, and she knew a little bit of Hebrew, not as much because the girls weren't as educated in it. And so to me, that provided both an incredible richness. It was fun for me as a writer to write, although hard, because the only languages I speak there are English and French. I learned a little Ladino. I sat in an Ladino class. There's someone named Gloria Asher who taught it at Tufts down the road from me. But I guess I was interested, as with many, many things with this book, in both the gifts of that multilingualism, that you were fluid, that I think language is culture, and that it provides a kind of visceral way to move through things. You can talk to lots of different people. You can see different ways of naming, even the way that, like in French, nouns have genders, and in English they don't. Like there's all these ways in which I think language forms the self, and that I've always been fascinated by how when I'm speaking French, I feel like a slightly different person, right? So there's incredible fluidity, but then there's also a lot of loss where you don't have one thing, right? And my grandmother, it was interesting because I would speak French to her. She would go into Spanish or Ladino, whatever mix, when she didn't want us to understand with my grandfather. She'd talk over our heads. She would write me cards in some mix of Ladino and Spanish, but she felt English. She was very self-conscious about her English. She never felt that it was good. And I think she never felt that she could I thought she was a beautiful speaker. And I have a video. I don't know if we're going to screen that, but when I was 21, I made these recordings of her, and I have a video on my website where you can actually hear clips from her voice. And she was a great storyteller, but it was interesting when I started to type them out to think about putting her actual voice in the novel. Her articulateness didn't translate when you wrote it word for word. There's that term broken English, and I hate that because it seems
Yeah,
very
I know. Yeah.
simple. But when you read it, you lost what was in fact a lot of fluidity and
In the
vibrancy.
speaking, yeah.
She always felt my mother told me that she took some English lessons when she got here, but I think she felt in some ways almost orphaned in terms of language, that there were too many, right? That there was a way in which she didn't get to speak the one that was her mother tongue
Sure.
in any public way. And my uncle David, who was born in Spain and came here when he was about 8, couldn't read or write at that point because he didn't go to school in Spain because they tried the Catholic school and it was terrifying for him. And then he didn't speak English. So I think, I don't know what your experience was, but I think for people arriving in a country not speaking the language can be extraordinarily difficult. You're just shut out, and you have this big inner life, and you're smart, and you have stuff to say, and you don't have a voice. So I was interested both in sort of the gifts of the crossing and all the flexibility that it gave her, and how people just have such a capacity to speak many languages, and you see that in Sephardic culture over and over. If you start early, you can have 7 languges.
Yes, yeah,
that's beautiful and very un-American, right? I was interested in how it shows that, and at the same time to not glorify it and make it seem like it's all just getting to speak in many tongues, because there's actually there's a loss, and the fact that Ladino wasn't the language of her school, and that all speaks to cultural forces, and the fact that it was French was because French was valued over Spanish and Ladino because of various political and empire building things. So language is also incredibly political, right?
Yeah, sure. But Sephardi people, as you say, have been known for knowing various languages.
Right.
Also because Sephardic people have always been sort of like port people.
That's right. They're always
because Sephardic people have been very international always.
Right. And Spain is interesting because it was Catalan and other dialects.
Exactly.
It wasn't even mostly Castilian Spanish.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. We would like to hear questions from the audience. Ron is going to be the intermediary.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go. Rabbi Jones Sachs asks about a glossary of terms that she's just saying, would that be helpful at some point?
In the book?
We thought about that and kind of decided not to. I can see that it might be annoying to readers to not have a glossary. I think I felt that I wanted as much as I could to kind of include translations through context, or sometimes directly, but often sort of through context, or, tucked into the next sentence or something, because one, I didn't want to break the spell of the story and have people having to flip outside to the back, but also I kind of similarly to some things I think I said about the title earlier, I don't mind if the reader's a little disoriented at times. I'm kind of like, well, welcome to the world of the novel. Like, they're disoriented at times.
Exactly.
And so I was interested. There's a writer some of you may know called Gloria Anzaldúa. Have you read her? She was Chicana, Mexican American, and she writes about kind of what it means not to translate. So I was interested in sort of those moments of not necessarily making it too easy. But I can also see that you don't want to be so annoying that someone will throw the book down,
We have an anonymous question comes in saying, I'm curious about Luna. Is she based on a real person?
Okay, so sure. So Luna, for those of you who've not read the book, is when Rebecca arrives in the United States for a second marriage. She has 2 children already and has lost her husband, and she marries Sam, based on my grandfather, who has also lost a spouse, his wife, and has a little daughter who has cerebral palsy. And so that became a very central part of the novel, was this blended family. Luna, I ended up giving her a point of view, which was very important to me in writing about a disabled character. And then really kind of exploring the relationship between Luna and Rebecca, which was complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Luna was a real person. I've used her real name. She was my aunt. She was my mother's half sister. I was close to her, but sadly she died before I started writing this story. And she, she was this girl born into this Sephardic family. Her mother died shortly after she was born in childbirth. So my grandfather had lost, by the time my grandmother came along, a wife and two babies, and he had this very disabled child. And at the time, she was born in the late 1920s, habitual practice would have been, especially for a single father, to have the child go into an institution. And he would not do that. And he used to tell us how she would cling on when she was a tiny baby. The doctor was saying, you can't raise this child. This child's never going to amount to anything. And she clung onto his finger with, how babies cling, and opened one eye and looked at him. And he was just like, that's it. We're going to figure it out. So he'd been raising her with his mother. And then Rebecca came along, not knowing fully what she was getting into. And so it's a very vexed relationship. But as I was saying earlier, Rebecca in the novel and my grandmother was very much someone who would get to work and make things, and who also really, I think, saw the dignity of every person. So she worked with Luna in extraordinary ways. The family before had loved Luna and petted her and put bows in her hair, but they weren't teaching her anything. They didn't know what her capacities were. So it turns out in real life and in the novel, my aunt was incredibly bright and incredibly spunky and determined, and living with a lot of things stacked against her, both in terms of prejudice and also even just kind of knowledge of cerebral palsy, which is what she had, and how to work with it. And my grandmother, they would both say, kind of worked miracles with her, with Luna working extraordinarily hard to kind of do these therapies. And they were both really spunky people. And she ended up, marrying twice. She had a child. She worked in the municipal, sort of for the city of New York. She had a career. And then in her retirement, she moved to Florida and she always kind of wanted to be a writer. And she wrote articles for the Sun Sentinel about Jewish life and being disabled and disability rights and kind of little community theater and stuff. So she was quite incredible. And as with everything else that I've been talking about, there's a lot of joy and a lot of inspiration and a lot of things that were really hard. And some of her relationship with my grandmother was hard, that they were sort of jealous of each other. There was vying for my grandfather. There was a step relationship. There were questions of sort of whether each parent's first loyalties were to their fully biological children from their first marriages. So it was a relationship that I was quite nervous about writing about. And it was actually my mother. I was struggling with the last part of the novel. And she said, if you want to get at who my mother was and what her life was like in this country, you have to write about Luna. And then I thought, how do I do that? And I've actually been interested in disability for a long time, and written about it in other ways, I think partly because of her. But I was like, I got to learn about it. So I read a lot about that era and what treatments were and what the prejudices were and things. And then I thought, I'm going to give her a point of view. I don't want to write about her. There's a lot of novels where there's a disabled character who sort of comes in and is used in some way that makes me uncomfortable. And I was like, she's going to have a point of view. So that was fascinating, actually. And I wish she'd been around for me to get her permission and to talk to her. But she wrote a little bit about her childhood, enough that I knew that my grandfather got her to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital and, sought out any care that was available.
It is really wonderful, if I can interject here. It is really wonderful how you give the space to the two of them. The space and also their resolve, and how your grandmother was stern, how she was stern.
She was hard on her.
She was hard on her with a purpose.
Right.
With the purpose to make her feel you can do it.
Right.
You can become. You can go to school and you can excel. And that is so wonderful in the novel.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it was a really interesting and rich relationship. And I think they were both very grateful. They taught each other things. Luna taught my grandmother things. She taught her kind of, my grandmother, as I said, relied on surfaces. And Luna was kind of like, yeah, you're telling me to, you're telling me to let people see who I am, but you won't leave the house without looking in the mirror at yourself. And, there were ways in which they held each other to account.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. That was so wonderful in the book.
Thank you.
One of the questions from Nurit Pat is precisely at what you've been answering here, and she's asking why you dedicated so much of the book to this relationship, and so I think you've already answered that question.
Okay, great.
Let's see. Ellen Fox asks about the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, which was about the time of the Ottoman Empire and the beginnings of Israel, and what you think about that? No.
I really loved the novel. I found the TV series a little melodramatic for my taste. There's another series but I thought the novel was quite wonderful, and I got to meet the author at one point when she was in Boston. There's another series that I really liked called Kulap, or The Club, Kulap.
Oh yes, oh yes.
It's set in Istanbul, in a nightclub. And later, I think it's in the 50s, but it's about a Sephardic woman and relatives of mine who've listened to the Ladino and seen the orphanage and things that say that it's extremely true to life. That's a really good series. The second part of it kind of got a little, again, melodramatic, but and there's some other wonderful books just quickly that I'll tell you. There's a really beautiful book that some of you may know by Michael Frank called 100 Saturdays, The Lost World in Times of Stability.
Yes.
And he interviewed a woman who's now over 100 in New York who was from the Isle of Rhodes and ended up deported to a concentration camp, but survived. And it's a gorgeous book that reads almost as fiction, where he sits and talks to her for many Saturdays. And at first she says, I'll talk to you, but I'm not going to talk about the camps. Like, that's not who I am. This is not what defines me. And to some extent, it's true. The book is about this very passionate woman who has a rich, full life in many different ways. But of course, it defines her also, because it's this terrible thing in the center of her life. So that's another book that I found, if you're interested in books about Sephardic. There's not much.
That's a wonderful book.
That's a wonderful book. Yeah.
We have a question, an anonymous question again, and it's asking, do you have any advice about tackling a novel based on your family's history? I have a story about my family from a shtetl in Ukraine, but don't have a specific family to follow in this sense. So anyway, I don't know. Do you have advice for a person?
I'm looking at the question, but I don't have a family left who lived in that little town in Iowa. Yeah, so that's why fiction's really great, because you can make it up and you can use kind of composite characters. There's a book that this person might want to read called Hotel Cuba by Aaron Hamburger, which is a book inspired by his grandmother who left a shtetl in Russia, I think. But I think the question, that's why it sounds like for this person, you draw on what you know, but then, you read, you look widely, you look at oral histories, you look, I'm a big fan of Ancestry DNA, their archival side. You can find all kinds of things. I don't know about the little town in Iowa, but probably there is stuff. I mean, I have found incredible stuff. I'm now looking on my father's side, which is there were Ukrainian people there. Just even censuses where you can see, like, oh, my father's father, when he was 1 year old, lived on in Fale Street in the Bronx, and his neighbors were Irish, and some of them were Jewish, and they were leather workers. Like, the details that come in these documents are actually incredibly rich, and then lend yourself to. And I also go to the places. I've already been to that Fale Street in the Bronx. I love to just stand there and imagine. So it's a funny mix between kind of, for me, using everything you do know about your family, but also relying on wider historical records and on kind of public documents like military documents and censuses and, anything you can find. But then if it's fiction, you make it up. You make up the
Sure.
family. They're
Sure.
going to scene.
Mhm.
Good luck. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Jenny Niles also mentions that her family made the move from Barcelona to Cuba and then to Queens, um, and that her own Baruch Levy family who left Turkey.
Really?
The question? Yeah.
Wow. In the book, some of your family.
How did
As
your
did my
family find their way to New
Libby.
York and Long Island?
Who left Turkey? How did your family? Okay, so it was interesting actually. My grandmother, in real life, my grandfather's family lived in like the Bronx and Spanish Harlem and much more Sephardic areas filled with Sephardic people. My grandmother did not want to live among them for several reasons. One, she was a snob and they were much of a different social class. And she thought, and they weren't as religious. She didn't like that they intermarried and she looked down on some of their ways. And she was really, truly a bit of a snob. She loved my grandfather. He was an autodidact. He was incredibly smart. He was more of an intellectual than she was, but he dropped out of school in 5th grade. And she found his family sort of suffocating. So she didn't, also because of Luna, they all had their hands on Luna and she wanted to make her own family. She also really, really, really wanted a garden. And we haven't talked about this yet, but land and flowers and seeds. My great-grandfather was a huge gardener. My mother's a gardener. We're all gardeners. And I think that for her, there weren't many places where they could afford or even be allowed to buy. There were, at that time in the 30s, there were rules. It was hard to buy houses as Jews in a lot of New York, Jews and Black people. And there were all kinds of prejudices against redlining, basically. And so Cambria Heights was this new community where you could build a little house or buy a little house, a planned community. And it was way out. It's almost on Long Island, as it sounds like and it was not, it was also, interestingly, getting back to Gloria, some of the things we were talking about, a very mixed community. My mother grew up with Irish kids. There was a big, fairly prosperous Black community there. Italian, Cuban. My grandmother's neighbor was a Cuban and she loved to speak Spanish with him. So I don't think she actually wanted to live amongst only Sephardic Jews, or if she would have, it would have been what she had in Turkey, which was this prosperous class where they went from house to house and, a certain kind of life. And that was
that.
What's that?
We know that.
You know that. So that wasn't going to happen. And so they moved to Cambria Heights, where they really did become part of it. The Jewish part was very important to them. They had a Jewish community, but it was mostly Ashkenazi. And they had a lot of other friends. And it's particularly my mother growing up had a lot of friends who were not Jewish and who certainly were not Sephardic. But there were Spanish speakers. So she would talk about the man across the street and how she would sing My Little Bird, Pajarito, is that right?
Pajareto.
Pajareto, you see my heart.
Pajareto. Yeah.
She would sing this little bird song with him.
Yeah.
Someone asked if you could repeat the information about the 100 Saturdays book.
Oh, sure. Let me make sure I have the title right. It's by Michael Frank, and it's called 100 Saturdays. It's the subtitle that I'm going to quick. 100 Saturdays, Stella Levy and the Search for a Lost World. Oh, there it is. Look at that. Amazing, Gloria. She's got it sitting right there.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful book. I've done talks with him. We're doing, if anyone's in LA, actually, on March 6th, I, and Michael and myself and a really amazing historian of Sephardic culture called Sarah Abravaya Stein at UCLA.
Yes,
we're giving a talk. Has she been on that? I met her yet. But she had to get back to the gardening. She has this very beautiful essay called Ruda or Rue, a plant's eye view of the diaspora, about the herb rue, which I then, when I read it, sprinkled even more. It was already in my novel, but I both went through more, and then I planted some in my garden.
And there is a song.
About Rue?
About Ruth, yeah. Una matica de ruda.
Matica de ruda, sí.
Una matica de ruda.
Wow. I don't think I know the song.
And we all had Rue in front of the door of our house.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, I interestingly, because this was all at several generations removed, but I'm quite
Yeah.
superstitious. So
Yeah.
every time I learn of another Sephardic superstition, I'm like, oh no, now I have to hang some
It's
rue.
fun.
It's fun. And I am
It's fun.
growing it. It's beautiful. It's got
Yeah.
like 50 leaves and a yellow flower.
Sure.
So thank you so much for this. And
Thank
It
you.
was wonderful.
it's been wonderful to hear your journey through writing the book, because we experienced the journey through reading the book, but your experience is one that's wonderful to understand it, give the background. So it's been our pleasure to
Yeah.
have you, and we appreciate you being here in the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today.
Thank you for all the wonderful voices you're sharing.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thanks everybody for coming.